Some wounds carve so deep into a man's soul that even time fears to touch them. In the wind-swept castle of Valdres, perched high above the Scottish Highlands, where mist clings to ancient stones like forgotten memories, Alpha King Magnus Thornwick sat alone on his throne. 5 years had passed since his son's death. 5 years since laughter echoed through these halls. 5 years since he'd felt anything but the cold bite of grief. The blood moon ceremony was ending, nobles departing into the night, when a small figure emerged from the shadows, a child no one had seen enter, no one recognized, yet somehow belonged. The boy's voice carried the weight of centuries as he whispered those impossible words that would either save a broken king or destroy him completely. Was this child a messenger from the realm beyond death, or something far more dangerous? Could a father's love truly reach across the veil between worlds, or was Magnus being led toward his own destruction by forces he couldn't begin to understand? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The child stepped forward, bare feet silent against the ancient stones, Magnus's breath caught in his throat, his knuckles white against the carved arms of his throne. The great hall, moments before filled with the rustle of departing nobles, now felt suspended in absolute stillness, as if the very castle held its breath. "What did you say?" The Alpha King's voice emerged as barely more than a growl, each word scraped raw from a throat that had forgotten how to hope. The boy couldn't have been more than 8 years old, with silver-white hair that caught the dying torchlight and eyes the color of storm clouds. His scent was wrong. Not quite Omega, not quite anything Magnus could identify. It carried hints of rain on mountain stone, of places between places, of secrets the earth kept buried. "Prince, Kea lives, Your Majesty." The child's voice remained steady, unafraid of the fury building in the Alpha King's presence. But he is lost between the veil of worlds, trapped where time moves differently, where pain echoes longer than it should. Magnus rose from his throne, the ancient wood groaning under the sudden absence of his weight. At his full height, he towered over the small figure, his presence filling the hall with barely contained violence. Lesser men had died for far less audacious lies. "My son is dead." Each word dropped like a stone into still water. I held his broken body. I laid him in the ground with these hands. His voice cracked on the last word, betraying 5 years of carefully constructed control. The child tilted his head, studying the king with an intensity that felt far too old for such young features. "You held what they showed, but grief makes us blind to deception, doesn't it?" The accusation hung between them like a blade. Magnus descended the steps slowly, each footfall echoing through the cavernous space. The torches seemed to flicker with his approach, shadows dancing across stone walls carved with the histories of his bloodline. "Who are you?" Magnus demanded, stopping just close enough that his overwhelming alpha presence should have sent any Omega child cowering. Instead, the boy remained perfectly still, as if he stood in the eye of a storm rather than its fury. "Names have power here," the child replied. "You may call me Whisper. I come bearing truths that have waited too long in darkness. Whisper." Magnus tasted the name, found it bitter as wormwood. "And what truths do you speak of, child? What game is this?" Something shifted in Whisper's expression, a flicker of something that might have been pity. "The night Prince Kale died, you were not with him. You were in the tower with Councillor Morven, discussing the grain shortage. You've replayed that choice 1,000 times, haven't you? Wondering if your presence might have changed everything." The words struck like physical blows. Magnus staggered back a step, his careful composure cracking. No one knew about his absence that night. No one knew about the guilt that aided him like acid, the knowledge that he'd chosen duty over his son's company for the last time. "How do you—" "Because I've seen him," Whisper interrupted, his small voice somehow filling the vast hall. "I've walked in the spaces between life and death, where lost souls wander. He calls for you, Alpha King. He has been calling for 5 long years." The great hall spun around Magnus. His legs threatened to buckle as memories crashed over him. Kale's laugh, bright as summer lightning, the weight of his son's small hand in his own, the way the boy's eyes lit up whenever Magnus returned from his duties. Then the darker memory, the mangled horse, the blood-soaked ground, the impossibly still form they told him was his heir. "You lie." But even as he spoke the words, Magnus felt their hollowness. Something in this strange child's presence resonated with a frequency he'd thought forever silenced. Truth has its own taste, doesn't it? Whisper moved closer, unafraid of the Alpha's barely leashed violence. "You've been living on the bitter dregs of guilt and rage for so long. You've forgotten what hope feels like. But I can take you to him. Take me where?" The question escaped before Magnus could stop it, revealing the desperate father beneath the Iron King. To the threshold. To the place where souls caught between worlds gather like moths around a flame that burns but gives no warmth. Whisper's eyes seemed to hold depths that shouldn't exist in a child. But the path demands payment, Alpha King. Are you prepared to face what was hidden from you? Are you ready to learn that your son's death was not the accident they claimed? The words hit Magnus like a physical blow. Accident. That single word had been the cornerstone of his grief, the foundation upon which he'd built 5 years of carefully controlled mourning. If that were a lie, who? The question emerged as a snarl. Who would dare? Whisper's smile held no warmth, only the cold promise of revelations that would burn away everything Magnus thought he knew about the night his world ended. "Come with me," the child whispered, extending one pale hand, "and learn what really happened to Prince Kael." Magnus stared at the extended hand, small, pale, impossibly steady, as if it were a viper poised to strike. The rational part of his mind, the part that had guided him through 30 years of kingship, screamed warnings. This was madness. Children didn't simply appear in locked throne rooms. The dead stayed dead. Hope was a luxury he'd buried with his son. But the desperate father that lived beneath his crown reached out anyway, his fingers trembling as they hovered inches from Whisper's palm. "Not here," the child said softly, lowering his hand. "Not yet. Your court would never understand, and there are those among them who would stop us if they knew." The words sent ice through Magnus's veins. "My court?" He straightened, the Alpha King reasserting himself over the grieving father. "You speak of conspiracy within my own walls?" "I speak of truths that will reveal themselves when you're ready to see them." Whisper stepped back, his storm-gray eyes never leaving Magnus's face. "For now, you must return to your ordinary world. Rule as you have ruled, trust as you have trusted. But watch, Alpha King. Watch with new eyes." Before Magnus could respond, the child melted into the shadows between the pillars, as if he'd never existed at all. The king lunged forward, but found only empty air and the lingering scent of rain on stone. "Guards!" His roar echoed through the hall, bringing the sound of running feet. The great doors burst open, admitting Captain Thane and 2 guardsmen, weapons drawn. "Your Majesty?" Thane's weathered face creased with concern as he took in Magnus's wild appearance, the overturned throne, the scattered torches. Magnus opened his mouth to explain, then closed it. What could he say? That a mysterious child had materialized in a locked room to tell him his son lived? That everything he'd mourned for 5 years might be a lie? "Nothing," he said instead, his voice rough. "A moment's weakness. Clear the hall. I'll retire to my chambers." If Thane thought the explanation insufficient, he was too wise to say so. The captain had served 3 kings, had seen Magnus through his darkest hours. He simply nodded and began issuing quiet orders to his men. Magnus made his way through Thornwick Castle's familiar corridors, past tapestries depicting his ancestors' victories, past portraits of queens and princes long dead. Everything looked the same. The stone walls worn smooth by centuries of passing hands, the torch brackets he'd helped polish as a boy, the very air thick with history and tradition. But something had changed. Whisper's words echoed in his memory, "Watch with new eyes." He paused outside the solar where his council met each morning, remembering a conversation from years past. Councillor Morven's voice, grave with concern, "The hunting trails in the eastern forests are treacherous this season, Your Majesty. Perhaps Prince Kael should wait until spring?" Magnus had overruled him, had insisted that his heir needed to learn the ways of the wild, that coddling would make the boy soft. How many times had he replayed that decision? How often had he cursed his own stubborn pride? But now, had Morven been trying to protect Cale? Or keep him from something else entirely? The king's private chambers felt smaller than usual as he entered, the walls seeming to press inward. His eyes fell on the desk where he conducted the kingdom's business. Trade agreements, tax assessments, judicial reviews. The mundane work that had consumed his life while his son lay dying. Or trapped. Or... He couldn't finish the thought. A soft knock interrupted his spiral. "Enter." Counselor Morven stepped inside, his lined face creased with what appeared to be genuine concern. The old man had been his father's advisor before him, had helped guide Magnus through the early years of his reign. "If anyone could be trusted, I heard there was some disturbance in the Great Hall, Your Majesty. Are you quite well?" Magnus studied his counselor's features, searching for any hint of deception. Morven's pale blue eyes held only worry, the same expression he'd worn when comforting Magnus after Cale's death. The same expression he'd worn when suggesting the prince stay home that fatal night. "I'm fine," Magnus said carefully, "though I find myself thinking of Cale tonight. Of that last hunt." Something flickered across Morven's face, too quick to identify, gone before Magnus could grasp it. "A tragedy that haunts us all, Majesty, but perhaps dwelling on such painful memories serves no purpose. The kingdom needs your full attention. The grain shortage in the northern provinces requires immediate action, and there are rumors of unrest." "Yes." Magnus cut him off, suddenly certain he didn't want to hear more. Not tonight. Not until he understood what game was being played. "Of course. We'll discuss it in the morning council." After Morven departed, Magnus stood at his window, gazing out at the storm-lashed highlands that had been his family's domain for 3 centuries. Somewhere out there, in the space between worlds, his son might be waiting. Or perhaps he was simply a broken king, grasping at phantom hope offered by a strange child who existed only in his desperate imagination. Either way, come morning, he would have to choose which truth to believe. Magnus did not sleep. He stood vigil at his window through the long hours before dawn, watching lightning fracture the sky above the ancient highlands. Each thunderclap seemed to echo Whisper's words, "Your son isn't dead." By the time pale morning light crept across the mountains, he had nearly convinced himself the encounter had been nothing more than a grief-induced hallucination. Then he saw the muddy footprints. Small, bare feet had left their mark on the pristine stones of his chamber floor. A trail leading from nowhere to the exact spot where Magnus had stood staring into the storm. His breath caught. The servants had cleaned these rooms yesterday evening. The prints were fresh. A sharp rap on his door shattered the moment. "Your Majesty, forgive the intrusion." Captain Thane's voice carried an urgency that made Magnus's pulse quicken. "There's been a development you need to see immediately." Magnus found Thane in the corridor with 2 of his most trusted guards, their faces grim. "What is it, Captain?" "The eastern watchtower, sire. The one overlooking Thornwick Forest." Thane hesitated, clearly struggling with how to present whatever he'd discovered. The guards reported strange lights in the night, moving through the trees near the ravine where Prince Cale. "Speak plainly," Magnus commanded, though his throat had gone dry. "Someone has disturbed the crash site, Your Majesty. Recent disturbance, and there are tracks leading away from it, heading toward the old ruins in the deep forest." The world tilted beneath Magnus's feet. The crash site had been left undisturbed for 5 years, marked only by a simple stone cairn he'd erected with his own hands. Who would dare desecrate his son's final resting place? "How recent?" he managed to ask. "Hours, sire. The tracks are fresh despite the rain." Magnus's mind raced. Either this was an impossible coincidence, or Whisper's appearance was connected to something far larger than a child's cryptic warnings. "Assemble a search party. We leave within the hour." "Your Majesty," Thane said carefully, "perhaps it would be wiser to send the guards ahead while you—" "No." The word came out harder than Magnus intended. "I will see this myself." As they prepared to depart, Magnus found himself studying his companions with new suspicion. 3 guards he'd known for years, men who'd sworn blood oaths to his family. Captain Thane, who'd carried Cale on his shoulders when the prince was barely walking. All of them moving with familiar efficiency, checking weapons and supplies for a routine investigation. But were any of them truly as they seemed? Whisper had spoken of deception, of truths hidden within his own court. How deep did the conspiracy run? The ride to the eastern forest felt like journeying backward through time. Magnus hadn't returned to this place since Kale's death, couldn't bear the memories it held. Now, as they approached the ravine where his son had supposedly died, every tree seemed to whisper accusations. Every shadow held the promise of revelation or heartbreak. The crash site itself made Magnus's blood run cold. The carefully arranged stones of the memorial cairn lay scattered across the forest floor. Deep gouges in the earth suggested something had been buried here, and recently excavated. The ancient oak that had supposedly claimed his son's life bore fresh scars, as if something had clawed desperately at its bark. But it was the symbol carved into the oak's trunk that stopped Magnus's heart entirely. A circle bisected by a wavy line. The mark of the threshold walkers, practitioners of the forbidden magic that dealt with the spaces between life and death. Magnus had seen it only once before. In an ancient tome his father had shown him as a warning against the old powers that still lingered in the deepest parts of the kingdom. "Your Majesty?" Thane approached cautiously. "What does it mean?" Magnus couldn't answer. His mind was reeling with implications that seemed impossible yet explained everything. The threshold walkers were myth, legend, stories told to frighten children. They couldn't still exist. They couldn't have taken his son to some realm between worlds. But the evidence lay before him, carved into living wood with disturbing precision. A new sound made them all freeze, the crack of a branch somewhere in the forest's depths. Something was moving through the undergrowth, something that didn't care about stealth. Magnus drew his sword, its familiar weight grounding him as his world continued to unravel. From the shadows stepped a figure in a tattered brown cloak, hood drawn low. Not Whisper. This person was too tall, moved with an adult's measured gait. When they spoke, their voice carried the rasp of someone who'd screamed themselves raw. "You're too late, Alpha King. The boy has already begun the crossing." The figure lowered their hood, revealing a face Magnus recognized with shock and growing horror. Alara, the court herbalist who'd served his family for decades. The woman who'd prepared Kale's body for burial. The woman who'd sworn on her life that the prince was truly dead. Her eyes now held the wild gleam of someone who'd stared too long into places no mortal should see. "Choose quickly," she whispered. "Save your son, or save your kingdom. The magic demands a price, and time grows short." Magnus felt the world fracture around him like glass struck by lightning. Alara, trusted Alara, who had served 3 generations of Thornwick kings, who had delivered Kale into the world and supposedly prepared his broken body for the grave, stood before him transformed into something unrecognizable. The woman who had wept genuine tears at his son's funeral now spoke of crossings and prices with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. "You're lying." The words tasted like ash in his mouth, but Magnus clung to them desperately. "Alara, what madness has taken hold of you? What crossing? What—" "No lies, Alpha King. Not anymore." Her voice carried notes of exhaustion and something that might have been relief. 5 years I've carried this burden. 5 years of watching you tear yourself apart with guilt while your son called out from the threshold. I cannot bear it another day." Behind Magnus, he heard the distinctive whisper of steel as his guards drew their weapons. Captain Thane stepped forward, his weathered face hard with suspicion. "Your Majesty, this woman speaks treason. Allow me to—" "Stay back," Magnus commanded, never taking his eyes from Alara's wild gaze. Something in her manner warned him that violence would solve nothing here. "Speak plainly, woman. If my son lives, if he can be saved, then tell me how. Tell me what price you speak of." Alara laughed, a sound like breaking bells. "Always the king first, aren't you? Even now, even with hope dangling before you like fruit from a poisoned tree, you think like a ruler." She gestured at the scattered stones, the clawed earth, the ominous symbol carved into ancient wood. The threshold walkers took him, yes, but not as captors, as protectors. He would have died that night, truly died, if they hadn't intervened. "From what?" Magnus demanded. "What threatened him that required such intervention?" The herbalist's eyes found each of the guards in turn, lingering on their faces as if reading secrets written there. From those who wanted him dead, Alpha King. From those who saw his Omega nature as a weakness that would destroy the kingdom when he took the throne. The words hit Magnus like a physical blow. Kael's secondary gender had been a carefully guarded secret, known only to the most trusted members of the court. An Omega heir was not unprecedented, but it was complicated. There would be those who saw it as vulnerability, others who might try to exploit it. Who? The question emerged as a growl, his alpha nature surging to the surface. Who dared threaten my son? But even as he asked, Magnus felt the first stirrings of a terrible doubt. In his mind, he could hear the voices of his counselors over the years, their subtle suggestions about Kael's delicate constitution, their recommendations that perhaps the prince needed stronger guidance, their concerns about the kingdom's future stability. How many of those conversations had been innocent worry, and how many had been something darker? The magic that saved him demands balance, Alara continued, ignoring his question. A life suspended between worlds cannot remain there forever. Either he returns to the living or he passes on to the dead. But the crossing back, it requires a sacrifice of equal weight. Magnus felt the ground shifting beneath his feet, not physically, but in every way that mattered. What sacrifice? The throne, or the kingdom, or the soul of the one who claims him? Her words fell like stones into still water, each one sending ripples through everything he thought he understood. Choose the throne and Kael returns, but you lose the crown forever. The magic will see to it. Choose the kingdom, and civil war follows within the year, brother fighting brother until the highlands run red. Choose your soul. She didn't finish, but the implication hung between them like a blade. Magnus closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 30 years of kingship pressing down on him. He had always known that rulership meant sacrifice, but this was beyond anything he had ever imagined. To save his son, his beloved lost son, he would have to destroy everything else he held dear. There must be another way, he said, but the words felt hollow even to his own ears. The magic is older than kingdoms, Alpha King, older than the bloodlines that built these castles. It recognizes only truth, only balance. Alara's voice had grown gentle, almost pitying. Your son waits at the threshold, but with each passing hour he grows weaker. Soon, the choice will be made for you. Magnus opened his eyes to find Captain Thane watching him with naked concern. Behind the captain's weathered features, he could see the same question that now tormented his own heart. What was a father willing to sacrifice for his child? What was a king willing to sacrifice for his heir? The answer terrified him more than any enemy he had ever faced in battle. Because deep in his heart, Magnus already knew what he would choose, and the knowledge felt like damnation. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, broken only by the whisper of wind through the ancient trees. Magnus stared at Alara, at the symbol carved into the oak, at the disturbed earth where his son's grave should have been, and felt the last vestiges of his old world crumble away. "Show me," he said quietly. The words fell from his lips before he fully understood their weight, but once spoken, they seemed to reshape the very air around them. Captain Thane stepped forward, alarm clear on his weathered face. "Your Majesty, surely we cannot trust—" "I said, show me." Magnus's voice carried the authority of 3 decades on the throne, but beneath it lay something raw, the desperate hunger of a father who had glimpsed impossible hope. "If my son lives, if he can be saved, then I will see him with my own eyes before I make any choice." Alara studied him with those wild, knowing eyes. "You understand what you're asking? To see across the threshold is to be changed by it. There will be no returning to ignorance, no pretending this is all madness or grief. Once you cross that line, Alpha King, you become part of something far older and more dangerous than your crown." Magnus thought of Whisper's storm-gray eyes, of 5 years spent drowning in guilt and hollow victories. He thought of the empty chair beside his throne, of the heir who would never inherit, of the grandchildren who would never climb onto his knee. All of it built on what now appeared to be a lie, or at least an incomplete truth. "I understand," he said, though he suspected he understood nothing at all. Alara nodded slowly, something like approval flickering across her features. "Then leave your guards here. What I must show you cannot be witnessed by those not bound to the magic." "Absolutely not." Thane's hand moved to his sword hilt. "I'll not leave His Majesty alone with someone who speaks of forbidden magic and impossible bargains." Magnus felt a surge of affection for the old soldier. Loyalty so pure it shone like a beacon in the growing darkness of conspiracy and doubt. But loyalty, he was beginning to understand, might not be enough to navigate whatever lay ahead. "You've served my family faithfully, old friend. Serve us now by ensuring we're not followed." Magnus clasped Thane's shoulder, feeling the tension in the captain's frame. "If I'm not back by sunset, return to the castle and seal the borders. Trust no one, not Morven, not the other counselors, no one, until you understand the true shape of this threat." Thane's jaw worked silently for a moment before he gave a reluctant nod. "As you command, Your Majesty. But if this woman means you harm, then Cale truly dies with me, and the kingdom faces civil war regardless." Magnus surprised himself with how calmly he spoke the words. "Sometimes, Captain, the greatest risk lies in refusing to take any risk at all." Alara had already begun moving deeper into the forest, following what appeared to be a game trail but which Magnus suspected served a different purpose entirely. The trees grew denser here, older, their trunks thick enough that 4 men couldn't link arms around them. This was the deep forest, the wild heart of the highlands, where his ancestors had once hunted dire wolves and worse things. The path, if it could be called that, wound through increasingly strange terrain. Stones balanced in impossible configurations, trees that grew in spirals rather than straight lines, clearings where the grass formed patterns that hurt to look at directly. Magnus felt his alpha senses straining against something that defied natural law, and wrongness that made his skin crawl even as it drew him forward. "The threshold is not a place," Alara said without turning around. "It's a state of being, a moment stretched beyond its natural span. Your son exists in the space between heartbeats, between breaths, between the decision to live and the surrender to death. How is that possible?" Magnus found himself whispering, though he couldn't say why. "Because someone loved him enough to break the rules." She paused, glancing back with an expression that might have been pity. "The magic always answers love, Alpha King. But it demands payment for its gifts." They emerged into a clearing unlike anything Magnus had ever seen. The air itself seemed to shimmer here, like heat haze but cold, and at the center stood what remained of an ancient stone circle. Only 3 of the original monoliths still stood upright, but they thrummed with an energy that made Magnus's teeth ache. And between them, barely visible like a reflection in disturbed water, stood a figure that stopped Magnus's heart entirely. Cale, not as he would be now, grown into full adulthood, but as he had been 5 years ago, 18, proud, beautiful in the way that had made every omega and beta in the kingdom sigh with longing. His son stood motionless in that impossible space, eyes closed, chest rising and falling with the rhythm of someone caught in the deepest sleep. "My boy," Magnus breathed, and took a step toward the circle. Alara's hand caught his arm with surprising strength. "Choose first," she said urgently. "Choose, or lose him forever." Magnus stared at his son's face, peaceful in that eternal moment between worlds, and felt his old life, his crown, his kingdom, his carefully constructed identity as the Iron King, fall away like a discarded cloak. "I choose Cale," he said, and crossed the threshold. The moment Magnus stepped into the stone circle, reality twisted like molten glass. The world didn't disappear. It layered, becoming multiple versions of itself existing simultaneously. He saw the clearing as it was now, ancient and overgrown, but also as it had been centuries ago when the full circle stood gleaming under different stars. Past and present bled together until he couldn't distinguish between memory and vision. But none of that mattered, because Cale was there, solid and real beneath his hands, as Magnus reached out to touch his son's face. Warm skin, the familiar scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood fall, the strong jaw that mirrored Magnus's own. This was his boy, trapped in some impossible twilight but undeniably alive. "Father." Cale's eyes fluttered open, storm gray like the child whispers, and for a moment confusion clouded his features. Then recognition dawned, followed by something that might have been relief or terror. "You came. I wasn't sure. The voices said you might not—" "What voices?" Magnus pulled his son closer, noting how Cale's form seemed to flicker at the edges, as if he were a candle flame threatening to gutter out. "Who has kept you here? Who did this?" Before Cale could answer, the air around them shimmered and new figures materialized within the circle. 3 robed forms, their faces hidden beneath deep hoods, moved with the fluid grace of those who had long ago transcended purely mortal limitations. The threshold walkers, no longer legend but undeniable reality. "The king comes at last," spoke the center figure in a voice like wind through dead leaves. We wondered if love would prove stronger than pride. Magnus instinctively stepped in front of Cale, his hand moving to his sword before he remembered that steel would likely prove useless here. "Release my son. Whatever bargain was made, whatever price—" "No bargain was made with us, Alpha King." The speaker's hood fell back, revealing the face of a woman who might have been 30 or 300, her eyes holding depths that spoke of years spent walking between worlds. "We intervened only to preserve a life that others sought to end. The choice to return him to your world. That power lies with you alone. Then I choose. Think carefully." A second walker stepped forward, this one's voice carrying notes of warning and compassion. "The magic that holds him here was born from desperate love, yes, but love alone cannot sustain him indefinitely. Each moment he remains suspended between life and death weakens the barriers that separate the realms. Continue this path, and you risk more than your crown or your kingdom. You risk the very fabric that keeps the living and the dead in their proper places." Magnus felt Cale's hand grip his arm, fingers cold despite the warmth of his skin. "Father, they're not lying. I can feel it. Something pulling at me, trying to drag me deeper into whatever this place is. The voices grow stronger every day, promising peace if I'll just let go and sink into the dark." "No." The word tore from Magnus's throat with primal force. "I will not lose you again. There has to be another way." "There is." The third walker spoke for the first time, their voice so neutral it might have belonged to a stone. "But it requires understanding the true nature of the threat your son faced. The magic that preserves him can be redirected, transformed from a prison into a weapon, but only if you're willing to face the enemies that drove him to this threshold in the first place." Magnus felt the world shift around him again, and suddenly they were no longer alone in the circle. New figures emerged from the swirling mists between worlds, men whose faces he recognized with growing horror. Counselor Morven, his trusted advisor, Sir Garrett, captain of his personal guard, Lord Ashford, who had dandled Cale on his knee as a child. All of them bore the mark of the threshold now, existing in the same liminal space as the walkers but carrying themselves with the bitter purpose of the betrayed. Their eyes held no warmth, no recognition, only the cold hunger of those who had chosen power over loyalty. "The conspiracy runs deeper than you know, Your Majesty," Morven said, his familiar voice now carrying echoes from beyond the grave. "An Omega heir was never acceptable to certain factions, but your son's death created opportunities we hadn't anticipated, opportunities that some of us have learned to exploit from this side of existence." Magnus understood with sickening clarity. The threats hadn't ended with Cale's supposed death. They had merely changed form. Somehow his enemies had followed his son into this realm between worlds, turning the magic meant to preserve him into a tool for their own dark purposes. "They're using him as an anchor." Alara's voice reached them from the edge of the circle, though. She remained in the mortal world. "His suspended state gives them purchase in both realms, power over the living and the dead alike." The first walker nodded gravely. "Now you begin to see. Your choice is not simply between crown and child, Alpha King. You must choose whether to face the true enemy, knowing that victory may require sacrificing everything you believe yourself to be." Magnus looked into his son's frightened eyes and felt something crystallize in his chest, not the cold resolve of a king, but the fierce protectiveness of a father who would burn down worlds to keep his child safe. "Tell me what I must do." The first walker stepped closer, their form solidifying in the strange light of the threshold realm. The ritual, to break their hold, requires 3 elements. Alpha King: truth, sacrifice, and transformation. You must speak aloud the shame that allowed this conspiracy to take root. You must surrender the power they seek to claim, and you must become something other than what you have always been. Magnus felt Chael's grip tighten on his arm, as the ghostly figures of the conspirators began to circle them like predators scenting weakness. Morven's spectral form smiled with cold satisfaction. "He will never speak it," the dead counselor hissed. The great Alpha King admitting his failures before his precious son, he would rather see the boy consumed by the darkness than reveal how thoroughly we deceived him. "What truth?" Magnus demanded, though ice was already forming in his stomach. "What shame?" The second walker's ancient eyes held infinite patience and terrible knowledge. "The secret you buried so deep you convinced yourself it never existed. The choice you made in the moments after your son's Omega nature manifested. The reason these men believed they could act against your heir with impunity." Magnus's mind reeled backward 5 years, to that terrible night when everything had begun to unravel. Chael had been 18, newly presented, and the scent of Omega pheromones had filled the castle like wildfire. But there had been something else that night, something Magnus had forced himself to forget. "You remember now." Morven's shade laughed. "How you raged against fate itself. How you called your son's nature a curse upon the bloodline. How you spoke of disinheriting, if he could not learn to suppress what he was born to be." "No," Magnus whispered. But the memories were flooding back now, unstoppable as an avalanche. His fury at discovering Chael's secondary gender, the harsh words spoken in private to his most trusted advisors, the desperate plans to hide his son's nature, to force him into behaviors that went against his very biology. "I was trying to protect him," Magnus said, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "You were trying to protect your legacy," the third walker said with devastating gentleness. "And in doing so you gave these men permission to believe that an Omega heir was indeed unacceptable. They simply took your private doubts to their logical conclusion." Chael's face had gone pale, his form flickering more violently now as the truth settled between them like a blade. "Father, is that true? Did you really say those things?" Magnus looked into his son's eyes and saw his own failures reflected there. The boy he had claimed to love above all else, standing in this impossible place because Magnus's own prejudices had created the very conspiracy that threatened him. "Yes," he said, the words scraping his throat raw. "God help me, yes. I was so afraid of what the kingdom would think, of how the other alphas would react, that I made you ashamed of what you were. I gave them the weapons they used against you." The spectral conspirators hissed in unison, their forms beginning to waver as the first element of the ritual took hold. Truth spoken freely was a powerful force in this realm between worlds. "The shame is acknowledged," the first walker intoned. "Now comes sacrifice. What will you surrender to break their hold upon your son?" Magnus understood with crystal clarity what was being asked. Not just his crown. That would be too simple. The conspirators fed on his kingly authority, drew power from the very position they had sought to influence. To truly break their grip, he would have to renounce not just his throne, but every aspect of the royal identity that had defined him for 3 decades. "I renounce my crown," Magnus said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I renounce my titles, my lands, my blood right to rule. I cast off the name of king and choose instead to be only what I should have been from the beginning, Chael's father." The words hit the ghostly figures like physical blows. Morven's form began to fracture, his expression shifting from triumph to desperate rage. "You cannot. The kingdom needs rulers who understand that love matters more than legacy," Magnus said firmly. "And if my abdication brings chaos, then perhaps that chaos will burn away the rot that allowed you to flourish." The air around them shimmered as the second element took hold, power bleeding away from the conspirators as their anchor point dissolved. But they were not finished yet. "Transformation remains," the second walker warned. "To complete the severing, you must become what you once rejected. You must embrace the Omega nature you saw as weakness and make it your strength." Magnus felt the magic of the threshold pressing against him, offering impossible change. To save his son, he would have to become like his son, vulnerable in ways that terrified him, dependent on bonds he'd spent a lifetime avoiding. But looking into Chaol's hopeful eyes, Magnus found the courage for one final surrender. "Then change me," he said simply. The magic hit Magnus like a physical force, driving him to his knees as every cell in his body began to rewrite itself. The change was not gentle. It tore through him like wildfire, unmaking 30 years of alpha dominance and rebuilding him into something he had spent a lifetime fearing. His scent shifted first, the commanding musk of an alpha king, dissolving into something softer, sweeter, unmistakably Omega. The transformation rippled outward from his core, altering not just his biology but the very foundation of how he experienced the world. Where once he had felt the constant drive to dominate and control, now he sensed the subtle currents of emotion and need that flowed between all living things. "Father," Chaol's voice cut through the haze of agony, and Magnus felt his son's hands on his shoulders, steadying him as the magic completed its work. But the conspirators were not finished. Even as their forms fractured from the loss of their anchor point, Morven's shade rallied for one final assault. "You think this changes anything?" The dead counselor snarled, his spectral form growing larger and more terrible as he drew power from the threshold itself. "You may have freed the boy from our immediate grasp, but the damage is done. The kingdom will tear itself apart when news of your abdication spreads. Civil war will consume everything you once protected." Magnus struggled to his feet, his new Omega senses reeling from the proximity to such malevolent energy. But beneath the disorientation, he felt something else. A clarity he had never possessed as an alpha. He could sense the true nature of these beings now, see past their threats to the desperate fear that drove them. "You're afraid," he said, his voice softer but somehow carrying more weight than his old kingly roar ever had. "All this time you weren't trying to save the kingdom from an Omega heir. You were terrified of what he might become." The second walker nodded approvingly. "Truth again. Speak what you see, Magnus, who was once king." Magnus looked at his son with new eyes, perceiving qualities that his alpha prejudices had blinded him to before. Chaol's Omega nature wasn't a weakness to be hidden. It was a source of power that these conspirators had desperately wanted to control or destroy. "Omegas bind," Magnus said, understanding flooding through him like dawn breaking. Not through force, but through connection. An Omega ruler wouldn't need to dominate the kingdom. He would unite it. Every alpha, every beta, every Omega would feel personally connected to the crown. Morven's shade let out a howl of rage. "You understand nothing. That kind of unity threatens everything. The old hierarchies, the established order, the corruption you fed on," Magnus finished. "A kingdom bound by genuine love and loyalty rather than fear would have no place for men like you." The third walker stepped forward, their neutral voice carrying notes of approval. "The transformation is nearly complete, but one trial remains. To fully break their hold, you must pass through the heart of their power, the moment of your son's supposed death. Face what really happened that day, and choose his life over the lie that has sustained your grief." The world around them shifted again, and suddenly Magnus was no longer in the stone circle, but in a different forest, 5 years in the past. He recognized the hunting trail, the ancient oak where they had planned to make camp. And there, crumpled at the base of the tree, lay Chaol's broken body. But now Magnus could see what his alpha senses had missed in that moment of overwhelming grief. The wrongness in the scene, the sense that didn't belong, the subtle signs of struggle that had been carefully concealed. "He didn't fall," Magnus whispered, horror and rage warring in his chest. Someone pushed him. "Sir Garrett." Chaol's voice came from behind him, and Magnus turned to see his son, as he had been that day, young, terrified, but very much alive. "He said you had sent him to fetch me back to the castle. When I told him I wanted to finish the hunt, he said you had given him permission to use whatever force was necessary." Magnus felt the final piece of the puzzle click into place. They hadn't just conspired against Chaol after his death. They had murdered him outright, then used Magnus's own grief as a weapon to prevent any investigation. "But the magic," Magnus said, looking between his living son and the memory of his broken body. "How did you survive?" "Mother's necklace," Cale said softly, touching the small pendant Magnus had barely noticed. The one she made me promise to always wear. She said it was just a family heirloom, but when I fell, when I should have died, it pulled me here instead. Magnus understood with crystalline clarity now. Even his queen had known this day might come, had prepared for it in the only way she could. The necklace held old magic, the kind that responded to desperate love and mortal peril. The conspirators' shades writhed around them as their final deception crumbled, their forms growing thinner and more desperate with each revelation. Choose, the first walker commanded, the lie that let you grieve in peace, or the truth that demands justice. Magnus looked at his son, alive, whole, waiting for a father brave enough to see past his own failures, and made the only choice that mattered. I choose truth, he said. I choose life. I choose love over law, mercy over might. The threshold realm exploded into brilliant light, and everything changed. The light shattered around them like broken glass, and Magnus felt himself torn from the threshold realm with violent force. He crashed back into his physical body in the castle's great hall, gasping and disoriented, his newly Omega senses screaming from the abrupt transition between worlds. But Cale was not with him. Magnus lurched to his feet, frantically scanning the hall. The assembled court stared at him in shocked silence, their faces reflecting confusion and something approaching horror. He could smell their fear, their revulsion at the Omega scent now emanating from their former Alpha King. "Cale!" Magnus called out, his voice cracking with desperate panic. "Cale, where are you?" Alara rushed to his side, her face pale with terror. "My lord, what happened? You've been unconscious for hours and you're sent. Where is my son?" Magnus grabbed her shoulders, no longer caring about protocol or dignity. "I found him, Alara. He was there. He was alive. And now, there is no one here but us," Alara whispered. And Magnus heard the breaking of her heart in those words. "You returned alone." The truth hit him like a physical blow. The brilliant light hadn't been victory. It had been the threshold realm collapsing. His choice of truth over lie, his transformation from Alpha to Omega, his renunciation of the crown, none of it had been enough. The conspirators' final gambit had succeeded even as their own forms dissolved into nothingness. They had forced him to break the very magic that kept Cale suspended between worlds, and without another anchor point ready, his son had been pulled into the true death that had been waiting for him for 5 years. "No," Magnus breathed, sinking to his knees as the full magnitude of his failure crashed over him. "No, this can't be how it ends." But even as he spoke, he could feel the truth settling into his bones, like winter frost. The throne room remained stubbornly empty of his son's presence. The Omega necklace that had preserved Cale lay cold and powerless in Magnus's palm, somehow transported back with him, but now nothing more than lifeless metal and stone. Chancellor Aldrich stepped forward, his face a mask of barely concealed disgust. "Your Majesty, the Council demands an explanation. Your condition presents certain difficulties for the stability of the realm." "I renounce the crown," Magnus said numbly, not looking up from the dead necklace. "I'm no longer your king." The declaration sent shockwaves through the assembled nobles. Voices rose in alarm, anger, and opportunistic calculation. Magnus could smell their emotions now with his transformed senses, the fear of the unknown, the hunger for power, the cold satisfaction of those who had always secretly opposed him. "Abdication requires formal procedures, Lord Ashford, the living Lord Ashford, not his ghostly counterpart, declared with obvious relish. Until those are completed, you remain bound by the duties of your station." "Duties." "I failed completely," Magnus whispered. Through his Omega perception, he could sense the web of deceit that still surrounded him. The conspiracy hadn't died with Morven and Garrett. It had merely evolved, adapted, found new hosts among the living. He understood now why his desperate gambit had failed. The threshold magic hadn't just been anchored to his crown and kingdom. It had been rooted in the very corruption he'd tried to renounce. By destroying one without cleansing the other, he'd simply guaranteed that Cale would be pulled into true death while the forces that had murdered him remained free to claim victory. Furthermore, Chancellor Aldrich continued, his voice taking on the formal cadence of legal proclamation, "An Omega cannot rule Valdris under any circumstances. The ancient laws are quite clear on this matter." Magnus felt bitter laughter bubble up in his throat. Of course. Even if he hadn't abdicated, his transformation would have stripped him of all legal authority anyway. The conspirators had played him perfectly, forced him to become the very thing they claimed was unfit to rule, then used his new nature as justification for everything they planned to do next. "The succession falls to the next male relative," Lord Ashford announced with poorly hidden triumph. "As the late prince died without issue, the crown passes to me." The voice cut through the chaos like a blade, and every head in the hall turned toward its source. Magnus looked up through his grief and saw a figure he barely recognized. His nephew Roderick, whom he hadn't seen in years, stepping forward with the confident bearing of someone who had been planning this moment for a very long time. The scent that reached Magnus's enhanced senses told him everything he needed to know. Roderick reeked of the same malevolent energy that had surrounded the ghostly conspirators. Whatever dark power had claimed Morven and Garrett had found a new vessel, a new way to claim the throne they had always coveted. "Guards," Roderick commanded, and soldiers Magnus had trusted for decades moved to surround him. "Restrain the former king. His condition clearly represents a danger to himself and others." As the bonds closed around his wrists, Magnus closed his eyes and felt the last of his hope crumble to ash. He had sacrificed everything, his crown, his nature, his very identity, and gained nothing but the knowledge that his son was truly dead, while his enemies had won completely. All was lost. The iron shackles bit into Magnus's wrists as the guards hauled him toward the castle's lower dungeons, but the physical pain barely registered against the crushing weight of his failure. Each step away from the great hall felt like a nail being driven into Cale's coffin. Final, irreversible, damning. "Careful with the former king," Roderick called out with mock concern, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "We wouldn't want history to say we treated him poorly in his diminished state." Magnus's omega senses picked up every nuance of satisfaction radiating from his nephew, every note of triumph that the man couldn't quite suppress beneath his performance of reluctant duty. But there was something else threading through Roderick's scent, something that made Magnus's blood run cold. Fear, not of Magnus, but for him. As if Roderick knew something terrible was coming that even he hadn't anticipated. The dungeon door slammed shut with a finality that seemed to echo through Magnus's very soul. He slumped against the cold stone wall, the dead weight of his son's necklace still clutched in his palm. 5 years of grief, and now he finally knew the truth. Cale had been murdered, had been trapped between worlds all this time, and Magnus's desperate attempt to save him had only succeeded in condemning him to true death. "I failed him twice," Magnus thought bitterly. Once by creating the hatred that killed him, and again by destroying the magic that preserved him. But as he sat in the suffocating darkness, something began to nag at the edges of his consciousness. His omega senses, still raw and overwhelming from the recent transformation, were picking up traces of something that shouldn't be there. A familiar scent, faint but unmistakable, that seemed to cling to the very stones around him. Cale's scent. Magnus lurched to his feet, pressing his face against the cold wall where the trace was strongest. It wasn't a memory or wishful thinking. His son had been here, in this very cell, and recently. But how was that possible? The threshold realm had collapsed. The necklace was powerless. Cale was... "Looking for someone?" The voice came from the shadows in the corner of the cell, and Magnus spun toward it, with his heart hammering against his ribs. A figure stepped into the faint light filtering through the barred window, and Magnus felt the world tilt on its axis. Cale. Not a spirit or a shade or a desperate hallucination, but his son. Solid, breathing, alive. "You're real," Magnus whispered, hardly daring to believe what his enhanced senses were telling him. "But how?" The threshold realm collapsed. I felt it break apart around us. "It did break apart," Cale said softly, moving closer with the careful grace Magnus remembered so well. "But you're thinking about it wrong, Father. The threshold was never what kept me suspended between worlds. It was just the place where the truth could finally be spoken." Understanding began to dawn on Magnus like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. The necklace. Your mother's necklace. It didn't stop working when the realm collapsed. Mother was cleverer than any of us knew. Kale confirmed, and Magnus could see tears glistening in his son's eyes. The magic wasn't tied to the threshold, it was tied to love. Specifically to the moment when someone who truly loved me chose my life over their own comfort, their own power, their own identity. Magnus felt his knees buckle as the full implication hit him. My transformation, my abdication, choosing truth over the lie that let me grieve safely. It wasn't about breaking the conspirators' hold. It was about proving to the necklace that I was finally worthy of having you back. The conspirators' destruction was just a side effect, Kale said with a sad smile. Mother's magic was always about love, not revenge. But it had conditions. The person trying to save me had to sacrifice everything that mattered to them more than I did. For 30 years, that was your crown, your alpha nature, your rigid ideas about strength and weakness. Magnus stared at his son, overwhelmed by the elegant complexity of his dead queen's final gift. She had known this day might come, had prepared for it, but she had also ensured that Kale could only be saved by a father who had truly learned to put love before power. But if you've been free since the transformation, Magnus said slowly, why didn't you appear in the Great Hall? Why let me think I had failed? Kale's expression grew grim. Because we're not finished yet. Roderick and his allies think they've won, but they don't understand what they're really dealing with. The corruption that claimed Morven and Garrett. It's not gone, Father. It just found a new host, and it's planning something that will make their original conspiracy look like child's play. Magnus felt the pieces clicking into place. His public downfall, his transformation into an Omega, his apparent imprisonment. It was all positioning for whatever came next. They think I'm broken, he said with growing understanding. Defeated, powerless, no longer a threat. Exactly. Kale's smile held an edge that reminded Magnus powerfully of his mother. Which means they'll never see us coming. For the first time in 5 years, Magnus felt something other than grief filling his chest. He felt hope. The first thing Magnus noticed as they sat together on the cold dungeon floor was how solid his son felt. After 5 years of dreams and visions that crumbled at the touch of waking light, the simple reality of Kale's shoulder pressed against his was almost overwhelming. His Omega senses drank in every detail, the warmth of living blood, the steady rhythm of breath, the complex scent signature that was uniquely, unmistakably his son. I keep expecting you to disappear, Magnus admitted quietly, his voice rough with exhaustion and wonder. To dissolve back into whatever realm spawned you. I'm not going anywhere, Kale said firmly. But we need to plan carefully. Roderick isn't just corrupt. He's possessed. The same entity that drove Morven and Garrett to murder me has found a new vessel, and it's had years to study your weaknesses. Magnus considered this, his mind finally beginning to work clearly again after the crushing despair of the past hours. What does it want? Power? The throne? Something much worse. Kale's expression darkened. It feeds on division, on the kind of bitter hatred that tears communities apart. An Alpha King ruling through fear and force provided some sustenance, but an Omega King who could unite the realm through genuine bonds of loyalty? That would starve it completely. So it needs to prevent that possibility, Magnus said, understanding dawning. Not just by killing you, but by making sure no one like you could ever rule again. Which means destroying the very concept of Omega leadership. Roderick's planning something for the coronation tomorrow, a public demonstration of Omega weakness that will make the old prejudices seem not just justified, but necessary for survival. Magnus felt his blood chill. What kind of demonstration? They're bringing Whisper to the ceremony. The words hit Magnus like a physical blow. Whisper, the mysterious Omega child who had first told him that Kale lived. In the chaos of recent events, he had completely forgotten about the boy's fate. They've had him this whole time, Magnus breathed. Used him as bait to draw me into their trap. Worse than that. Kale's voice carried notes of fury that reminded Magnus that his son had inherited more than just Omega gentleness from his bloodline. They're going to execute him publicly, claiming he's a dangerous mystic who corrupted your mind with false visions. It's designed to make you break completely, charge forward in a hopeless rescue attempt that will only prove how irrational and unstable Omegas become under pressure. Magnus felt the familiar rage building in his chest. But it was different now. Cleaner, sharper, unmuddied by the constant territorial aggression that had defined his alpha years. His Omega nature transformed the anger into something more useful, absolute clarity about what needed to be done. "Let me guess," he said grimly. "When I inevitably prove my unfitness by trying to save an innocent child, Roderick will have no choice but to formalize new laws ensuring no Omega can ever threaten the realm's stability again. And anyone who objects will be reminded of what happened to the great Alpha King Magnus when he was exposed to Omega influence for too long." Cale nodded approvingly at his father's reasoning. "It's elegant, thorough, and it uses your own protective instincts as the weapon to destroy everything Mother died trying to preserve." Magnus closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the trap settling around him. Even knowing what they planned, how could he stand by and watch an innocent child die? But charging to the rescue would only play into their hands, provide exactly the proof they needed that Omegas were too emotional, too irrational, too dangerous to be trusted with real power. "There has to be another way," he said finally. "Something they won't expect." "There is," Cale said quietly. "But you're not going to like it." Magnus opened his eyes, meeting his son's gaze. In those familiar features, he could see echoes of the queen he had loved and lost, the brilliant tactical mind that had navigated court politics with such grace. "Tell me." "We give them exactly what they want," Cale explained. "You break, you charge forward, you play the part of the unhinged former king perfectly. But while everyone's attention is focused on your public meltdown, I'll be moving through the castle, using passages Mother showed me years ago. By the time they realize what's happening, both Whisper and I will be free, and you'll be in position to expose the truth about what really killed me." Magnus felt his heart clench. "You're asking me to pretend to abandon you again, to perform the role of a father who cares more about his grief than his son's life. I'm asking you to trust me the way you should have 5 years ago," Cale said gently. "To let me be strong instead of constantly trying to protect me from everything." For a moment, Magnus hesitated. Every instinct screamed against deliberately walking into a trap, against playing the fool when so much hung in the balance. Then he looked at his son, alive, determined, unbroken despite everything he had endured, and felt something settle into place in his chest. "All right," Magnus said softly. "Let's give them a show they'll never forget." The next few hours passed in careful preparation. Father and son huddled together in the dungeon's shadows as they refined their desperate gambit. Cale sketched maps of the castle's hidden passages on the stone floor with a fragment of mortar, his fingers tracing routes their enemies had long forgotten. Magnus memorized every detail, his Omega senses now sharp enough to follow scent trails and detect heartbeats through solid walls. "The coronation begins at dawn," Cale murmured, erasing the chalk dust diagrams with his sleeve. "Roderick will want maximum attendance. He needs witnesses for what he's planning to do to Whisper." Magnus felt his jaw clench at the thought of the child, probably terrified and alone somewhere in the castle's upper reaches. "How do we know they haven't already?" "They need him alive for the public spectacle," Cale said firmly. "Roderick's puppet masters understand theater. A dead child proves nothing but a child killed by Omega corruption while the crowd watches. That creates the kind of trauma that shapes policy for generations." The cold calculation behind it made Magnus's skin crawl. He had ruled for 30 years, had made countless difficult decisions in the name of stability and strength. But this level of deliberate cruelty was something he had never imagined. "You've changed," Cale observed quietly, studying his father's face. "I can see it in how you hold yourself, how you process information. The transformation wasn't just physical, was it?" Magnus considered the question, trying to find words for the fundamental shift he felt in his very core. "Everything's softer now, but also more focused. As an alpha, I always felt like I was standing in a storm of competing impulses, territorial, aggressive, constantly ready for conflict. Now it's like the storm has passed and I can actually see what needs to be done. Mother always said alphas were cursed to care about everything except what truly mattered," Cale said with a sad smile. "She thought you might be happier as an Omega, if you ever had the courage to choose it." The words hit Magnus with unexpected force. his brilliant queen, who had seen through his bluster and bravado to the heart of what he truly was. Had she known, even then, that this day might come? Had she prepared for it not just with the necklace's magic, but with her gentle attempts to show him that strength and dominance were not the same thing? I wish I could have told her she was right, Magnus said softly. You'll have the chance, Cale replied. After we finish what she started. A distant bell began to toll somewhere above them, marking the hour before dawn. Magnus felt his pulse quicken as the reality of what they were about to attempt settled fully into his bones. So much could go wrong. Cale might be captured in the passages, Whisper might already be dead, the entity possessing Roderick might see through their deception before it was too late. But for the first time in 5 years, Magnus felt like he was finally moving toward something, instead of running away from it. The grief that had defined him for so long was still there, but it no longer consumed everything else. His love for his son, his determination to honor his queen's sacrifice, his newfound understanding of what true leadership meant. These things burned brighter now than his pain ever had. When this is over, Magnus said carefully, what then? Even if we expose the conspiracy, even if we save Whisper, I've still abdicated. The law still says an Omega can't rule Valdris. Cale's smile held depths that reminded Magnus powerfully of his mother's political brilliance. Laws can be changed, Father, especially when the people demanding change have just saved the kingdom from a demonic conspiracy, and especially when they've proven that Omega leadership might be exactly what this realm has always needed. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the corridor outside their cell. Guards coming to fetch him for the coronation ceremony, no doubt. Magnus rose to his feet, testing the bonds around his wrists one final time. They were loose enough to slip free when the moment came, but tight enough to maintain the illusion of helplessness. Remember, Cale whispered as the key turned in the lock, you're not performing grief this time. You're performing hope, masquerading as desperation. Let them see how much you still care, how far you'll go to protect an innocent. That's what will sell the deception. Magnus nodded, then embraced his son one last time. Solid, warm, real beyond any shadow of doubt. Whatever happened in the next few hours, they would face it together. Not as alpha and heir, bound by rigid expectations of dominance and submission, but as father and son united in purpose. The dungeon door swung open, revealing the stern faces of royal guards who had once followed Magnus into battle. Now they saw only a broken Omega, defeated and harmless. They had no idea what they were really looking at. As the guards escorted him toward what everyone believed would be his final humiliation, Magnus felt something he hadn't experienced since the day Cale died. Absolute certainty that he was exactly where he needed to be. The game was about to begin. The great hall had been transformed into a theater of power, every detail calculated to remind the assembled nobles of the natural order they believed had been violated. Banners bearing Roderick's newly claimed heraldry hung where Magnus's had once displayed the royal wolf, and the ancient throne, carved from a single piece of Highland granite, gleamed under torchlight that cast dancing shadows across the vaulted ceiling. Magnus shuffled forward between his guards, letting his shoulders bow under the weight of manufactured despair. His Omega senses catalogued everything, the nervous sweat of minor lords who weren't certain backing Roderick had been wise, the predatory satisfaction radiating from the new king's inner circle, and underneath it all, something else, something cold and ancient that didn't quite belong to any human sense signature. The entity Cale warned me about, Magnus realized. It's here, watching through Roderick's eyes. The crowd parted before them with a mixture of curiosity and revulsion. Many of these people had served under Magnus for decades, had benefited from his protection and prosperity. But now they looked at him like something diseased. The speed with which loyalty could transform into disgust might have surprised his former alpha self. But his Omega nature understood it perfectly. They weren't just rejecting him, they were rejecting the terrifying possibility that their entire worldview might be wrong. Behold, Roderick's voice boomed across the hall as Magnus was forced to his knees before the throne. The Omega who would have been king. Look upon what your former ruler has become, weak, broken, led astray by delusions and false prophets. Magnus kept his eyes fixed on the stone floor, playing his part while his enhanced hearing tracked movement throughout the hall. Somewhere in the walls around them, Cale would be making his way toward wherever they held Whisper. Every second Magnus could buy him was precious. "But we are merciful," Roderick continued, his voice carrying notes that definitely didn't belong to the man Magnus remembered. "We do not blame you for the corruption that poisoned your mind. We blame the source of that corruption, the dangerous mystic who filled your head with impossible dreams." A door at the side of the hall opened, and Magnus's heart clenched as they dragged Whisper forward. The child looked impossibly small between the armored guards, his dark hair matted and his clothes torn, but his strange violet eyes burned with the same mysterious intensity Magnus remembered from their first meeting. "This creature," Roderick snarled, gesturing toward the boy, "claimed to speak for the dead. Fed you lies about your son's survival, twisted your grief into weapons against your own kingdom." Magnus let himself look up then, let carefully crafted hope bloom across his features as he stared at Whisper. The performance had to be perfect, desperate enough to seem genuine, but not so controlled that it appeared calculated. "Please," he whispered, his voice carrying just far enough for the front rows to hear. "He's just a child. Whatever you think he's done, he's innocent." "Innocent?" Roderick laughed, and the sound carried harmonics that made several nobles shift uncomfortably. "This thing poisoned the mind of our king, made him abandon his crown, his nature, his duty to his people. And you still defend it?" The accusation hung in the air like a challenge, and Magnus felt the weight of every gaze in the hall. This was the moment, his chance to save himself by condemning Whisper, or his opportunity to prove everything they believed about Omega weakness. Magnus chose a third option. "I defend him," he said clearly, "because I remember what it means to protect the innocent, because some truths are worth more than crowns." He struggled against his bonds, letting desperation creep into his voice. "Cale is alive, Roderick. I've seen him, spoken with him. And when he returns..." "When he returns?" Roderick's eyes gleamed with something that definitely wasn't human. "Pathetic creature. Your son is 5 years dead, killed by Omega corruption just like this child will be." The blade appeared in Roderick's hand as if conjured from shadow, and Magnus felt his carefully maintained control threaten to crack. This was supposed to be theater, manipulation, a carefully orchestrated deception. But watching Whisper face death with quiet dignity, while the crowd bayed for blood, Magnus discovered that some things transcended strategy. He had been an Alpha King for 30 years. He had been an Omega for less than a day. But in that moment, as he watched innocents prepare to die for the crime of speaking truth, Magnus finally understood what his queen had always known. Leadership wasn't about being strong enough to dominate others. It was about being brave enough to stand between evil and the defenseless, regardless of the cost. Magnus slipped his bonds and lunged forward, not because the plan demanded it, but because his heart would accept nothing else. The final test had begun. The hall erupted into chaos as Magnus's body slammed into Roderick's, both men crashing into the base of the granite throne. The blade meant for Whisper's throat clattered across stone as nobles shrieked and guards rushed forward. But Magnus barely heard them. His Omega senses were locked onto something far more terrifying. The thing wearing Roderick's face was laughing with genuine delight. "Yes," it hissed, its voice layering over itself in impossible harmonics. "Finally, show them all what you really are, Omega King. Show them the beast that lurks beneath your gentle facade." Magnus rolled away from grasping claws that had erupted from Roderick's fingertips, his enhanced reflexes serving him well as the entity shed its human pretense. Around them, the assembled nobles backed away in horror as their new king's form began to shift and writhe, reality bending around the ancient malevolence that had worn Roderick's identity like an ill-fitting coat. This isn't the plan, Magnus thought desperately, dodging another swipe that left deep gouges in the stone floor. Kel expected a human adversary, not whatever this thing is. 30 years I watched you, the entity snarled, its voice echoing from multiple throats as Roderick's body continued its grotesque transformation. 30 years of feeding on the fear and hatred your iron rule generated. But you had to change, didn't you? Had to become something pure and noble and utterly indigestible, Magnus's back hit the wall beside the throne as he understood with crystalline clarity what they were truly fighting. Not just a political conspiracy, but something that fed on division itself, something that needed the realm torn apart by prejudice and fear to survive. "You killed my son," Magnus said, his voice carrying across the hall despite the chaos. "Not to gain power, but to break me. To turn me into something bitter enough to feed you forever." "Clever Omega," it praised mockingly, advancing on limbs that bent in ways human joints never could. Yes, the boy's death was exquisite. Such pure anguish, such perfect despair. You seasoned yourself beautifully for consumption. Around them, guards stood frozen in terror as their understanding of reality crumbled. These were men trained to fight human enemies, not creatures that violated the fundamental laws of existence. Only Whisper seemed unsurprised by the revelation, his violet eyes tracking the entity's movements with disturbing familiarity. "But then you had to ruin everything," the thing continued, its form now more shadow than substance. "Had to find hope, find love, find that insufferable Omega tendency toward healing instead of hatred. Do you have any idea how difficult it is to digest prey that insists on becoming enlightened?" Magnus felt along the wall behind him, his fingers finding the hidden lever Cale had described, an ancient mechanism that controlled the hall's massive chandelier. If his son had reached Whisper's cell, if their timing was perfect, then perhaps... Looking for rescue, former king? The entity's laughter was like breaking glass. "Your precious son won't be coming. My servants have been waiting for him in those passages for hours. Even now they're demonstrating what happens to foolish princes who think death is merely temporary." The words hit Magnus like physical blows, but his Omega nature transformed the despair into something sharper. This creature fed on emotional extremes, on the kind of overwhelming grief that left its victims helpless. But Omega's strength had never come from invulnerability. It came from the ability to function even while broken, to protect others even while hurting. "You're lying," Magnus said quietly, and pulled the lever. The chandelier came down like the fist of an angry god, its massive iron frame crushing the stone where the entity had stood. For a moment, silence filled the hall as dust settled, and nobles crept from their hiding places behind overturned benches. Then shadows began to flow out from under the wreckage, reforming into a shape that hurt to look at directly. "Disappointing," it said, sounding genuinely petulant. "I had hoped for more imagination from the legendary Magnus Thornwick. Dropped ceiling fixtures? Really?" But Magnus was no longer listening to its taunts. His Omega senses had caught something impossible, a familiar heartbeat approaching through the walls, accompanied by the light footsteps of a child. The sound of hope incarnate. "Hello, Father." Cale stepped through the hidden panel behind the throne, supporting a shaky but alive Whisper with one arm. His clothes were torn and bloody, evidence of the fight he'd had with whatever guardians the entity had placed in his path, but his eyes blazed with the same determination Magnus remembered from the boy's living years. "Impossible," the entity snarled, its form wavering as if Cale's mere presence disrupted its hold on reality. "You're dead. I killed you myself." "You killed my body," Cale agreed, helping Whisper stand on his own feet. But some things are harder to destroy than flesh and bone. Around them, the great hall held its breath as the true confrontation finally began. The entity's form convulsed with rage, shadows writhing like smoke in a hurricane. "This changes nothing. You're still dead, boy, and your father is still just a broken Omega playing at heroism." But Cale stepped forward with calm certainty, and Magnus felt something shift in the very air around them. His son's presence carried weight now, not the simple gravity of a living person, but something deeper, something that made reality itself pay attention. "Tell them," Cale said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "Tell them what you really are, what you've been feeding on for decades." "I am power," the entity shrieked. "I am the natural order. Alphas rule, Omegas serve, and fear keeps everyone in their proper place." "You're a parasite," Whisper said quietly, his small voice somehow cutting through the creature's roars. "You've been eating their kingdom from the inside, growing fat on hatred and division." The assembled nobles pressed closer despite their terror, finally beginning to understand what had been manipulating their realm. Magnus saw recognition dawn on face after face, the sudden realization of how much fear and prejudice had shaped their recent decisions. For 30 years, Magnus said, his Omega voice carrying new authority, we thought strength meant crushing those beneath us. We thought order required oppression. But all we were doing was feeding this thing our souls, one cruel law at a time. The entity lunged toward him with desperate fury, but Kale moved between them. Where his hands touched the creature's shadowy form, light blazed, not the harsh glare of fire, but something warm and steady that made the shadows recoil. You want to know how I survived? Kale asked, advancing as the entity retreated. Love. Simple, stubborn, unreasonable love. Even dead, I couldn't let go of the people who mattered, and neither could Mother. Magnus felt his heart clench as understanding flooded through him. The necklace, the transformation, Whisper's appearance, none of it had been coincidence. His queen had found a way to reach across death itself, weaving a web of protection and possibility that this moment had always been designed to fulfill. The choice is simple, Kale continued, his light growing brighter. Keep feeding this thing with hatred and fear, or choose something else. Choose to trust that strength comes from unity, not dominance. Around them, the great hall trembled as ancient magic responded to spoken truth. The entity's form was dissolving, its power draining as the very foundations of its existence cracked. But it rallied for one final assault, gathering itself into a spear of pure malevolence aimed directly at Whisper's heart. Magnus moved without thought, placing himself between the creature and the child. The shadow spear pierced his chest like ice in agony, and he felt something vital tear inside him, not his flesh, something deeper. The warm certainty that had sustained him since his transformation began to leak away, leaving only pain and the terrible knowledge of what he was losing. Father! Kale's voice seemed to come from very far away. Magnus dropped to his knees, his hands pressed against a wound that wasn't quite physical. Around him, the entity's laughter echoed with triumph, as shadows began gathering for another strike. Did you think sacrifice would save you? It taunted. I've been feeding on noble deaths for centuries. Your pain will sustain me for... But the laughter cut off abruptly as golden light began pouring from Magnus's wound. Not bleeding out, flowing in. The love he'd felt for his son, his queen, his people. The determination to protect innocence regardless of cost. The hard-won wisdom that true strength meant lifting others up rather than holding them down. All of it blazed forth in waves that sent the entity stumbling backward. No, it whispered, its form already beginning to fray. This isn't how it works. Sacrifice feeds darkness, not when it's freely given, Whisper said, his violet eyes bright with understanding, not when it comes from love instead of despair. Magnus felt the light spreading through him, transforming the wound into something else entirely. Where the entity had tried to steal his newfound purpose, he'd given it willingly, and in doing so, had somehow made it infinitely more powerful. The creature screamed once, a sound like reality tearing, and dissolved into nothing. In the sudden silence that followed, Magnus remained kneeling on the stone floor, his chest heaving as he tried to process what had just happened. The pain was gone, but something fundamental had changed. He could feel it in the way the air moved around him, in the reverent quiet of the assembled nobles, in his son's proud smile. He had given up his Omega nature to save Whisper's life, but somehow, in making that sacrifice freely and completely, he had become something else entirely, something the kingdom had never seen before, something it desperately needed. Magnus slowly rose to his feet, his legs unsteady, but his spirit blazing with newfound clarity. The golden light that had poured from his wound was fading now, settling into something deeper, a warm certainty that seemed to emanate from his very bones. Around him, the great hall remained tomb-silent, hundreds of nobles and guards staring at him with expressions ranging from awe to terror to desperate hope. "Is it over?" someone whispered from the crowd. The voice belonged to Lady Ashford, one of his oldest advisors, and Magnus could hear 30 years of accumulated fear dissolving in those 3 simple words. "The entity is gone," Whisper confirmed, his small hand slipping into Magnus's larger one. The child's violet eyes were bright with exhaustion, but also with something that might have been satisfaction. The curse that bound Prince Kael is broken. The poison that has been eating your kingdom from within has been cleansed. But even as relief began to ripple through the assembled crowd, Magnus felt the weight of a different kind of reckoning settling over them all. The creature's destruction had revealed the scope of its influence. Decades of laws designed to promote division, policies that had fed fear and hatred, traditions that had turned neighbor against neighbor. "Father," Kael said softly, and Magnus turned to find his son's spirit beginning to shimmer with translucent light. "I have to go now. The bridge between worlds is closing." Magnus's heart clenched, the prospect of losing Kael again nearly overwhelming. But his transformed nature allowed him to feel the grief without being consumed by it, to experience loss while still recognizing the gift they'd been given. "I know," Magnus said, reaching out to touch his son's face one last time. His fingers passed through nothing but warm air, yet somehow he could still feel Kael's presence, still sense the love that had sustained them both through darkness. "Your mother is waiting." "She is," Kael confirmed, his smile radiant. "And she's proud of what you've become, what you've chosen to become." Around them, the assembled nobles began to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Not just the departure of the dead, but the birth of something entirely new in their kingdom's governance. "What happens now?" Lord Garrett called out, his voice cracking with uncertainty. "The crown, the succession, the laws, everything has changed." Magnus looked out at the sea of faces surrounding him, seeing not subjects to be ruled, but people to be served. The entity's destruction had stripped away more than just its malevolent influence. It had revealed how much of their suffering had been manufactured, how much of their division had been artificially cultivated. "Now we rebuild," Magnus said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall with effortless authority. Not as alphas ruling over omegas, not as nobles commanding commoners, but as people working together toward something better. "But the old ways," someone began. "The old ways fed a monster," Magnus interrupted gently. "For 30 years, I believed that strength meant crushing opposition, that order required oppression. But all we accomplished was creating the perfect environment for that creature to feast on our pain." Whisper stepped forward, his young voice somehow carrying the wisdom of ages. "The kingdom needs leaders who understand that true power comes from unity, not dominance, who know that protecting the innocent matters more than maintaining tradition." Magnus felt a ripple of uncertainty move through the crowd as the implications became clear. The transformation he'd undergone wasn't just personal, it was systemic. Everything they thought they knew about leadership, about social order, about the very nature of strength and weakness, would need to be reconsidered. "Some of you supported Roderick because you feared change," Magnus continued, his omega nature allowing him to speak truth without cruelty. "Others, because you genuinely believed that maintaining the old order was best for the realm. But we've seen where that path leads. We've seen what grows in soil watered by fear and hatred." Kael's form was growing fainter now, his time in the world of the living nearly exhausted. But his voice still carried clearly as he spoke his final words. "Love one, Father. Remember that when the work gets hard, when people resist change, when you doubt whether any of this was worth it, love one." And then he was gone, leaving only the lingering warmth of benediction. Magnus looked down at Whisper, then out at his transformed kingdom. The golden light had settled completely now, but its effects were permanent. He could feel it in the way the air moved, in the subtle shift of every relationship in the hall, in the growing realization that they stood at the threshold of something unprecedented. The immediate battle was over. The entity was destroyed, the curse broken, the conspiracy exposed. But the real work was just beginning. The slow, difficult process of building a kingdom based on unity instead of division, on protection instead of domination. Magnus squared his shoulders and prepared to begin the most important reign of his life. The great hall slowly emptied as dawn broke through the tall windows, painting the ancient stones in shades of gold and rose. Magnus remained on the dais, Whisper beside him, watching his nobles and guards file out in small clusters. Their faces carried a mixture of wonder and uncertainty, the expression of people whose entire worldview had been shattered and remade in the span of a single night. "They're afraid," Whisper observed quietly, his violet eyes tracking the departing figures with surprising understanding for one so young. "They should be," Magnus replied, but there was no harshness in his voice. "Everything they've known about power, about their place in the world, it's all different now." He paused, feeling the truth of his own transformation settling into his bones like warmth after cold. "I'm afraid too." It was a confession the old Magnus would never have made. The Alpha King, who had ruled through iron will and crushing authority, would have seen fear as weakness, uncertainty as failure. But this new version of himself, shaped by loss and love, by sacrifice and redemption, understood that acknowledging fear was the beginning of wisdom. Lady Ashford approached the throne with hesitant steps, her weathered face creased with 30 years of court politics. She had served as his advisor since before Cale's birth, had watched him transform from young prince to grieving tyrant, and now to something entirely unprecedented. "Your Majesty," she began, then stopped, uncertainty clouding her features. What do I call you now? The old titles seem inadequate." Magnus descended from the dais, moving with a fluid grace that still felt foreign in his transformed body. When he reached Lady Ashford, he took her hands in his, a gesture that would have been unthinkable from the Alpha King, but felt perfectly natural now. "Call me Magnus," he said simply. "We're going to be working together as equals from now on, all of us." Her eyes widened, and he saw decades of carefully maintained deference warring with newfound possibility. But the social order, the hierarchy, how will anything function without clear lines of authority? "Better," Whisper interjected, moving to stand beside Magnus with the confidence of a child who had helped save a kingdom. "It will function better because people will choose to follow instead of being forced to obey." Over the following hours, as servants cleaned the debris and courtiers gradually returned to tentatively explore this new reality, Magnus began to understand the full scope of what lay ahead. The entity's destruction had left a power vacuum that went far beyond simple succession. It had eliminated the very foundation upon which their society had been built. Sir Garrett, captain of the Royal Guard, was among the first to formally approach the new regime. He knelt before Magnus with obvious discomfort, his scarred face struggling to process the changes he'd witnessed. "My lord." "Magnus," he corrected himself awkwardly. "What of the army? What of the border disputes with Aldermere? They expect strength, expect the show of force that maintains our sovereignty." Magnus studied the man who had served him faithfully through 3 decades of increasingly harsh rule. Garrett was a good soldier, loyal to his core, but shaped entirely by the old understanding of what strength meant. "Get up, Garrett," Magnus said gently. "No more kneeling. And as for Aldermere, when did we last try negotiation instead of intimidation?" The captain rose slowly, confusion evident in every line of his body. "Negotiation it's seen as weakness, my lord. Other kingdoms respect only force. Other kingdoms fear only force," Magnus corrected. "But fear breeds resentment, resentment breeds rebellion, and rebellion feeds the kind of darkness we just destroyed. Perhaps it's time to try earning respect instead." As the day progressed, more of his court approached with similar questions, each one revealing how deeply the entity's influence had penetrated their thinking. Trade disputes resolved through economic pressure rather than cooperation. Marriage alliances based on dominance rather than mutual benefit. Even the kingdom's internal policies had been designed to maintain strict hierarchies that fed the creature's appetite for division. By evening, when the last petitioner had left, and the hall stood empty except for Magnus and Whisper, exhaustion weighed heavily on them both. Magnus settled onto the throne steps. The throne itself felt too distant, too symbolic of the isolation that had nearly destroyed him. "Was I right to send them away to think?" he asked the child who had started this transformation. "Perhaps I should have given them clearer direction, more definitive answers." Whisper settled beside him with the unconscious grace of one who had never known rigid social boundaries. "Change has to come from inside," the boy said wisely. "You can show them a new path, but they have to choose to walk it themselves." Magnus nodded, understanding flowing through him like the golden light that had marked his transformation. He was no longer the Alpha King who commanded through power and fear, but he wasn't quite sure yet what he had become instead. What he did know was that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that love could indeed triumph over hatred, that unity could replace division. The real work was just beginning. The morning light streaming through the great hall's windows felt different, softer somehow, as if even the sun itself had been transformed by the previous night's events. Magnus remained where he was on the throne steps, watching dust motes dance in the golden beams, while Whisper dozed against his shoulder with the exhausted contentment of a child who had saved the world. 6 months had passed since that pivotal night. 6 months of stumbling progress, of small victories and frustrating setbacks, of learning what it meant to lead through love instead of fear. The great hall bore little resemblance to the austere chamber where the Alpha King had once held court. Gone were the rigid hierarchies, the formal protocols that had kept ruler and subject separated by ceremony and tradition. In their place, Magnus had created something unprecedented, a council where voices mattered more than titles, where the wisdom of a baker carried equal weight with that of a lord. "Your Majesty," came a familiar voice, and Magnus looked up to see Lady Ashford approaching. But she no longer walked with the careful deference of a subordinate. Her steps carried the confidence of a trusted partner. "The delegation from Aldermere has arrived." Magnus smiled, remembering Garrett's initial horror at the idea of negotiating from a position of perceived equality rather than strength. The first border summit had been awkward, with neighboring kingdoms uncertain how to interpret Valdris's dramatic transformation. But trade had flourished under cooperative agreements, and the refugees who had once fled Valdris's harsh rule were slowly returning home. "How do they seem?" Magnus asked, rising with the fluid grace that still surprised him sometimes. "Curious," Lady Ashford replied with a knowing smile. "King Edmund himself came, instead of sending representatives. I think he wants to see for himself whether the stories are true." Whisper stirred, violet eyes blinking open with that peculiar awareness that made the child seem far older than his years. "They're scared," he said simply. "Their kingdom has shadows too. Not like the entity, but sadness, hunger, people who've been forgotten." Magnus felt his heart clench with familiar compassion. The transformation that had remade him personally had also fundamentally altered how he perceived suffering. Where the Alpha King had seen weakness to be exploited, he now saw pain that could be healed, fear that could be replaced with hope. "Then we show them what we've learned," Magnus said, helping Whisper to his feet. "That strength shared is strength multiplied." The council session that followed would have been unthinkable under the old regime. King Edmund of Aldermere, a proud alpha in his 60s, sat at a round table, no head, no hierarchical seating, alongside Magnus, Lady Ashford, Garrett, and even Thomas the baker, whose insights into common folks' needs had proven invaluable. "I confess," Edmund said carefully, "I came expecting to find weakness, a kingdom ruled by sentiment instead of strength." He paused, studying Magnus with calculating eyes. "Instead, I find something I don't have words for. Purpose," Whisper supplied helpfully from his seat beside Magnus. "You find people working toward the same goal instead of fighting over scraps." The negotiations that followed produced the most comprehensive peace treaty in either kingdom's history. Not just an agreement to avoid war, but a framework for cooperation that would benefit both realms. As Edmund prepared to leave, he pulled Magnus aside with obvious reluctance. "My own kingdom grows restless," he admitted quietly. "The old ways of maintaining order. They're not working as they once did. People ask questions, make demands. I don't know how to rule subjects who refuse to remain subjects." Magnus felt the familiar weight of responsibility, but it no longer crushed him as it once had. "Then perhaps it's time to stop trying," he said gently. "Come back in the spring. Stay for a month, watch how we do things here. See if any of it might work for your people." That evening, as Magnus walked through the castle corridors that had once echoed with fearful whispers, he marveled at the transformation. Servants moved with dignity instead of cowering submission. Guards smiled at the children who played in courtyards once forbidden to common folk. The very stones seemed to radiate warmth. He found Whisper in the old library, curled up with a book of fairy tales that the child insisted were actually historical accounts from other realms. The boy looked up as Magnus entered, violet eyes bright with contentment. "Are you happy?" Whisper asked with characteristic directness. Magnus considered the question seriously. The Alpha King would have dismissed happiness as irrelevant. Rulers dealt in power and control, not emotional satisfaction. But this new version of himself, forged in loss and redeemed by love, could acknowledge the deep joy that filled him each morning. "Yes," he said simply. "For the first time in 30 years, I'm truly happy." Outside the window, evening stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere among them, Magnus liked to think, Kale and his beloved queen watched over the kingdom they had helped save. Their love had reached across death itself to offer redemption, to prove that even the darkest curse could be broken by sacrifice freely given. The work would continue tomorrow. There were still inequalities to address, still fears to heal, still hearts to open to the possibility of something better. But tonight, Magnus allowed himself to simply exist in this moment of hard-won peace, grateful for the child who had whispered impossible words and changed everything. Love had indeed conquered death, and in doing so, it had given them all a new beginning.